The first time I realized I was being used wasn't when I overheard the plan to replace me. It wasn't even when I discovered the man who slept beside me every night was still meeting another woman for strategic dinners. It was when his mother smiled at me across a marble dining table that cost more than my car and said very calmly, "We don't expect you to understand how families like ours work." Families like ours. She said it the way surgeons talk about organs they're about to remove. At that moment, I understood something terrifying. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a placeholder, a delay tactic, a temporary solution while the real future was being negotiated behind closed doors. What they didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that I had already built companies, dismantled competitors, and survived losses that would have broken people twice my age. They thought I was quiet because I was small. I was quiet because I was counting lies, counting money trails, counting how long it would take before the truth collapsed their world. I let them believe I was insignificant. I let them believe I needed them. I even let him put a ring on my finger, not because I loved him, but because I wanted a front row seat when everything burned. By the time the champagne was poured at our engagement gala, federal investigators were already watching the exits. By the time his family realized who I really was, it was too late to pretend this was just a misunderstanding. This isn't a love story. It's the story of what happens when powerful people underestimate the wrong woman, and how silence, when used correctly, can be the most dangerous weapon in the room. I met Ethan Blackwood on a Tuesday that felt aggressively ordinary. The kind of Tuesday where the coffee tastes burnt, your inbox is full of meetings that should have been emails, and nothing about your life hints that it's about to derail in a very expensive direction. He was sitting across from me at a small nonprofit fundraiser in Brooklyn, one of those minimalist spaces with exposed brick and chairs that look like art installations but feel like punishment after 10 minutes. I was there because a friend had begged me to come. Ethan was there because his name was on the donor wall in brushed steel letters, slightly larger than everyone else's. We started talking because the auctioneer's microphone failed, and someone joked that even the sound system couldn't handle wealth inequality. Ethan laughed, not loudly, politely, like a man trained never to draw too much attention to himself in public. He asked what I did. I told him I worked in tech. He nodded, immediately relaxed, and asked if I did product coordination or program support. That was the moment, though I didn't know it yet, when everything set itself in motion. I said, something like that. I didn't lie, I just didn't correct him. Ethan was charming in the way men are when they believe they're slightly above you but still interested. He opened doors, he remembered details, he texted good morning messages that felt thoughtful without being invasive. He listened just enough to feel safe. And I let that version of myself exist. The Avery who lived in a modest apartment. The Avery who wore neutral colors and didn't talk about work. The Avery who drove an aging Subaru that still made a questionable noise when turning left. Dating Ethan was easy. Too easy. He liked that I didn't need much. He liked that I was low maintenance. He liked that I didn't ask questions about his family. In hindsight, those were not compliments. They were permissions. 3 months in, he invited me to dinner at his mother's penthouse on the Upper East Side. Not dinner with friends, not a casual drink. Dinner with family. He said it like it was a milestone, like an honor, like a test I should be grateful to take. Just so you know, he added casually, my mom can be intense. I smiled and said, so is my barista. He didn't laugh, but he smiled politely, which I would later recognize as a pattern. The Blackwood penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building that pretended not to notice Central Park, even though it absolutely knew it was there. Everything was marble, glass, and restrained menace. The kind of home that whispers, we have lawyers. Ethan's mother, Eleanor Blackwood, greeted me with a smile that never reached her eyes. She looked me up and down, not slowly, not dramatically, but efficiently, like an appraiser. "Ah," she said, "you must be Avery." I was tempted to respond with, "No, I'm the caterer," but decided to save my sense of humor for later. Dinner was immaculate. Too immaculate. The table settings were symmetrical enough to suggest therapy was involved. Eleanor asked me questions the way prosecutors ask witnesses. Where did I grow up? What did my parents do? Did I enjoy my work? Each answer was received with a nod that suggested she had already drawn conclusions and was merely waiting for confirmation. When I mentioned I worked at a tech company that partnered with nonprofits, her interest visibly dimmed. "That's admirable," she said, the way people talk about recycling. Ethan's sister, Victoria, arrived late, dressed like she'd confused the dinner for a magazine cover shoot. She barely acknowledged me before launching into a story about a delayed flight and how exhausting it was to deal with inefficient systems. I smiled and nodded, thinking briefly about the algorithms I'd designed to optimize systems 10 times larger than her entire worldview. Ethan said almost nothing. That was the first crack. He didn't interrupt when his mother talked over me. He didn't correct Victoria when she referred to my job as support work. He squeezed my hand under the table once, as if that counted as bravery. After dessert, Eleanor excused herself to take a call. Victoria leaned toward Ethan and said, not quietly, "She seems sweet, very grounded." Grounded. Another word people use when they mean non-threatening. Ethan laughed softly and said, "That's what I love about her." That night, as we rode the elevator down, Ethan asked if I was okay. I said yes, which was true, because I hadn't come to impress them. I'd come to observe. And what I saw, even in that first evening, was a family that mistook silence for simplicity and modesty for weakness. They thought they'd measured me. They had no idea they hadn't even found the scale yet. When we stepped out onto the street, Ethan kissed my forehead and said, "They'll warm up to you." I smiled, got into my car, and drove home. And somewhere between the red light on Lexington and my apartment door, I made a quiet decision. If this relationship was going to continue, I wasn't going to correct a single assumption they made about me. Not yet. Because people are always more honest when they believe you don't matter. And I wanted to know exactly who I was dealing with. The next few weeks unfolded with a strange, polite tension, like a dinner party where everyone is smiling while mentally ranking one another's usefulness. Eleanor Blackwood began inviting me to things. Not directly, of course. The invitations came through Ethan, phrased as afterthoughts. "My mom is having a small thing on Sunday," he'd say. "Nothing fancy. She thought you might want to come." Small, in Eleanor's vocabulary, meant fewer than 20 people and only one photographer. I said yes every time. I wore simple dresses, neutral colors, flats, no logos. No jewelry beyond a thin watch I'd owned for years. I arrived on time. I brought polite gifts, wine, books, flowers that didn't scream money. And I watched. Eleanor never asked about my ambitions, only my availability. Victoria never asked my opinion, only my background. Their friends asked questions that sounded friendly but landed like audits. "So what does your family do? How long have you known Ethan?" "Oh, tech. That must be fast-paced." Fast-paced. Another safe word. Like gluten-free, but for social class. At one brunch, a woman whose name I'd already forgotten leaned over and whispered, "It must be comforting, knowing Ethan will always be able to provide." I smiled and said, "It's comforting knowing I can provide for myself." She blinked twice, like a browser tab had crashed. That was when I noticed something important. Ethan never defended me, but he also never contradicted them. He let the narrative form naturally. Avery is sweet. Avery is simple. Avery is lucky. And I began to realize he benefited from that story more than anyone else. Around week 5, I overheard my name used in a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. We were at Eleanor's penthouse again, a fundraiser this time, which meant waiters with identical haircuts and conversations about impact that somehow never involved actual people. I'd stepped away to find the restroom when I passed a half-open study door. Eleanor's voice floated out, sharp and controlled. "She's appropriate for now," she said. A pause. "Yes, I know she's not permanent." I froze. I didn't lean in closer. I didn't breathe louder. I just stood there, my hand resting on a door frame that probably cost more than my first apartment. Victoria responded, her tone bored. "Does Ethan know?" Eleanor laughed softly. "He knows what's expected." The floor didn't drop out from under me. That surprised me. What I felt instead was clarity. Later that night, in the car, I asked Ethan directly, "Do you think your family likes me?" He hesitated half a second too long. "They just take time," he said. "They're selective." Selective, like customs. I nodded and said nothing else. That silence did something interesting. Ethan relaxed. Men like Ethan mistake quiet for agreement. They confuse patience with compliance. It's a common error, a fatal one sometimes. Over the next few days, the invitations slowed, but the scrutiny increased. Eleanor started asking about my long-term plans. Victoria casually mentioned Charlotte Winthrop for the 3rd time in one dinner. "Oh, you'd love her," she said brightly. "She and Ethan grew up together, same schools, same values." Values. There it was again. Ethan's phone buzzed constantly now. He started stepping away to take calls. He stopped, leaving his phone face up on the table. One night I joked, "You're more popular than my spam folder." He laughed too loudly and said it was work. I let it go. Not because I believed him, but because I wanted to see how far he'd go. There's a particular moment in every story like this where the protagonist has a choice. You can confront, you can walk away, or you can wait. I chose wait, because waiting gives people space to reveal themselves. A week later, Eleanor invited me to lunch, just the two of us. That should have been my warning sign. She chose a restaurant that didn't list prices, the kind of place where menus are suggestions and judgment is complimentary. She got straight to the point. "Avery," she said, folding her napkin precisely, "I want to be clear with you." I smiled. "I appreciate clarity." She studied me for a long moment. "You and Ethan are very different people." "Yes," I said. "I've noticed." She continued. "Our family has expectations, responsibilities, alliances." Alliances. I waited. "Relationships," she said carefully, "are rarely just about feelings." I tilted my head. "That sounds exhausting." She didn't smile. "I'm sure you care about Ethan," she said. "But caring isn't always enough." There it was, the soft dismissal, the polite warning. I nodded and said, "I agree. Caring without honesty is pointless." Something flickered in her eyes. She hadn't expected that answer. Lunch ended shortly after. As I walked back to my car, I felt oddly calm, focused, like the first move in a chess game had finally been made. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and opened my laptop. I didn't search Ethan. I searched Blackwood. Public records, old filings, obscure articles, financial disclosures that most people would never bother to read. And as the tabs multiplied across my screen, a familiar sensation settled in. The feeling I get right before a system fails, before patterns emerge, before people who think they're untouchable discover they are, in fact, very much within reach. I leaned back in my chair and laughed quietly to myself. Because the thing about being underestimated is that no one notices when you start preparing. And if you were in my position, watching a future being negotiated around you without your consent, would you have spoken up immediately? Or would you have stayed quiet just long enough to learn everything you needed to know? I'm curious what you would have done. I read the comments more than you'd think. Either way, the game had started. And this time, I wasn't the one being evaluated. There's a difference between suspicion and confirmation. Suspicion makes you anxious. Confirmation makes you methodical. By the time I finished my second week of quiet research, I no longer suspected the Blackwoods were hiding something. I knew they were. I just didn't yet know how badly it would bleed once exposed. The Blackwood Family Trust was structured like a fortress. Layered LLCs, offshore holdings, shell companies that owned other shell companies. Nothing illegal on the surface, just opaque enough to discourage curiosity, which, unfortunately for them, has never discouraged me. I wasn't looking for crimes. Not yet. I was looking for pressure points. Every system has one. Usually more than one. You just have to stop assuming the people who built it were smarter than you. They weren't. What I found first wasn't dramatic. No smoking gun, no hidden vaults. It was timing. Large cash movements clustered around political fundraisers, transfers that coincided suspiciously well with zoning changes, regulatory delays, and a particularly convenient environmental exemption that allowed one of their investment projects to proceed despite community opposition. Money wasn't being moved, it was being guided. And Victoria's name kept appearing where it shouldn't. Not prominently, not blatantly, but often enough that I started smiling every time I saw it. Victoria Blackwood, CFO, darling of the family, woman who spoke about efficiency the way others spoke about religion. She was sloppy, not careless, just arrogant. People like Victoria don't believe they'll ever need to explain themselves. They grow up assuming systems exist to protect them, not expose them. That assumption creates blind spots big enough to drive indictments through. Meanwhile, Ethan was unraveling in smaller, more human ways. He canceled plans more frequently, claimed work emergencies that didn't line up with his calendar, started complimenting me more often, but in a strange, hollow way. "You're so easy to be with," he said one night, as if ease were the highest praise a woman could earn. I smiled and said, "I try not to be a problem." He laughed, relieved. That laugh told me everything. A few days later, I met Samuel Reed. Technically, it was an accident. I was sitting alone at a quiet wine bar in Soho, nursing a glass I'd ordered purely to justify occupying the chair, when a man at the counter turned and looked at me like he'd just found a misplaced memory. He didn't approach right away. He watched, subtle, careful. The way journalists do when they're deciding whether a story is worth the risk. Finally, he walked over and said, "This is going to sound strange, but are you Margaret Cole's granddaughter?" I nearly choked. Margaret Cole, my grandmother, the woman whose name I hadn't heard spoken aloud by a stranger in over a decade. "Yes," I said slowly. "Why?" He smiled, not triumphantly, but sadly. "Then I'm very sorry," he said, "and very impressed." Samuel Reed had been a respected investigative journalist once, before a libel lawsuit buried him, before sources dried up, before editors stopped returning his calls. The lawsuit had been funded indirectly by the Blackwood Family Trust. Not illegal, just effective. We talked for hours. I didn't tell him everything. He didn't ask for everything. We danced around the truth like two people who understood the value of patience. Before he left, he said, "Be careful." I smiled. "I am careful." He shook his head. "No, you're deliberate. There's a difference." That night, Ethan didn't come home. He texted at midnight. "Work ran late. Don't wait up." I didn't respond. Instead, I opened a folder on my laptop and added a new name to it. Charlotte Winthrop. It took less than 10 minutes to confirm what Eleanor and Victoria had been circling since the beginning. Charlotte wasn't just an ex. She was a plan. Old money, political connections, energy sector interests that aligned perfectly with one of the Blackwood's most questionable investments. Ethan wasn't cheating out of passion. He was hedging. That realization hurt less than I expected. Maybe because betrayal feels different when it's strategic, less personal, more insulting. A week later, Ethan proposed. He did it at Eleanor's penthouse, of course, in front of the city skyline, champagne already chilled, photographer conveniently nearby. The ring was large, flashy, slightly overcompensating. I noticed the diamond's imperfections immediately. Tiny inclusions. A cut designed to sparkle in low light, not scrutiny. A ring built for appearances. Eleanor watched me like a hawk. Victoria smiled like she already knew the ending. Ethan looked hopeful. Not loving, hopeful. That should have been my cue to say no. Instead, I said yes. The room exhaled. Eleanor smiled with genuine relief. Victoria clapped. Ethan kissed me like a man congratulating himself. And somewhere deep inside, a switch flipped. They thought the engagement was a solution. They had no idea it was a deadline. Over the following days, things accelerated. Invitations, calls, planning meetings that felt more like board discussions than celebrations. I was suddenly included, but only superficially. Seating charts, color palettes, guest lists. Never finances, never strategy, never truth. That was fine, because while they were planning a wedding, I was mapping a collapse. And here's the thing no one tells you about moments like this. Revenge doesn't feel hot. It doesn't feel angry. It feels calm, focused, like cleaning glass. I watched Ethan lie more easily now. Practice had made him smooth, almost impressive if it hadn't been so transparent. I watched Eleanor shift from dismissive to cordial, sensing something she couldn't quite name. I watched Victoria drink a little more, talk a little louder, brag a little harder. Pressure does that to people. And beneath it all, the truth sat quietly, waiting. They thought they were bringing me into their world. What they didn't realize was that I'd already found the cracks in it. And once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. You just decide when to apply pressure. Engagement changes people. Not because love suddenly deepens or commitment sharpens, but because masks get heavier, and eventually, someone's arm gets tired. The morning after Ethan proposed, Eleanor sent me a message before Ethan even woke up. "So happy you're officially part of the family now. We'll need to discuss a few practical matters." Practical, her favorite word. At breakfast, Ethan was unusually affectionate. Coffee in bed. Compliments that landed just a second too late, like lines delivered after the laugh track. "You're handling all of this really well," he said, squeezing my hand. "Most people would be overwhelmed." Most people. I smiled and said, "I've always been good under pressure." He nodded, reassured, and went back to his phone. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from Eleanor in her penthouse office, an elegant room designed to intimidate without raising its voice. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a desk that suggested power rather than productivity, a faint smell of expensive wood polish and control. She didn't waste time. "Marriage," she said, folding her hands, "is a merging of interests." I waited. "You and Ethan come from very different backgrounds," she continued. "That's not necessarily a problem, but it does require structure." Structure. Another word that meant obedience. She slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents, prenuptial outlines, asset disclosures, behavioral clauses disguised as family agreements. I skimmed quickly. No claims on my assets, no financial disclosures required for me. They really did think I had nothing. That all seems very thorough, I said. She smiled. We like to avoid surprises. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked, Does Ethan know about this? Of course, she said smoothly. That was a lie. Not a big one, just a convenient one. As I left, she added, One more thing, Avery. I turned. Charlotte will be attending the engagement gala. I nodded. That makes sense. Her eyebrows twitched. It does? Yes, I said. She's part of the family narrative. She studied me carefully then, searching for distress. She found none. Over the next week, the engagement gala became the only thing anyone talked about. Venue approvals, guest list curated like military alliances, political figures, industry leaders, people whose presence sent signals. Ethan was suddenly very busy, very distracted, very careful with his phone. One night he left it face down on the counter. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. Trust is what people rely on when they assume you're not dangerous. Instead, I met Samuel Reed again. This time it wasn't an accident. We sat in a quiet corner of a public library, neutral ground. He brought documents, I brought questions. What happens, I asked, when a family trust quietly violates 3 regulatory boundaries while thinking no one's paying attention? Samuel smiled. Usually, nothing. Until everything. We compared notes. He filled in historical context, old grudges, patterns of intimidation. The lawsuit that had ruined him hadn't been meant to win. It had been meant to exhaust. Classic tactic. They don't expect retaliation, he said. They expect silence. I nodded. They've mistaken me for quiet. He laughed softly. Common error. At home, Ethan began rehearsing the future. When we're married, he'd say, when things settle down, when this all works out. He never said if. One evening, I casually asked, What would you do if your family disapproved of something important to you? He paused. Depends, he said. Is it realistic? That was my answer. 2 days later, I followed him. I told him I had a late call. He kissed my cheek and left early. I parked across the street from the restaurant he'd mentioned in passing weeks earlier. And there she was, Charlotte Winthrop, elegant, confident, leaning forward across the table. Their hands met casually, familiarly, not passionately, not secretly, professionally. I watched for 20 minutes. He smiled differently with her, less guarded, more certain. At one point, she touched his wrist and said something that made him laugh, really laugh. The sound surprised me. I took one photo, not for proof, for memory. When I got home, I didn't cry. I didn't confront him. I didn't even feel angry. I felt organized. The pieces fit now. Ethan wasn't trapped. He was participating. That night, I accepted 3 more invitations on the gala guest list. I also made a few calls. Very specific calls. The kind that don't get returned immediately, but do get remembered. By the end of the week, the engagement gala had become something else entirely. Not a celebration, a convergence. Eleanor sensed it. I could tell by the way she watched me now. Longer, sharper. Victoria drank more openly. Ethan oscillated between confidence and nerves. At dinner one night, Victoria joked, You're surprisingly calm about all this. If it were me, I'd be a mess. I smiled sweetly. Oh, I plan better under pressure. She laughed, missing the point entirely. Sometimes I wonder who gets to decide when a story turns. The person who lies, or the person who waits. Either way, by the time the invitations were printed, the ending was already written. They just didn't know it yet. If you want to understand how powerful people think, watch what they ignore. The Blackwoods ignored details, not because they were careless, but because they were accustomed to outsourcing consequences. They assumed lawyers would handle risk, accountants would handle numbers, Publicists would handle perception, and women like me would handle themselves quietly. The week before the engagement gala felt like standing inside the eye of a very expensive hurricane. Eleanor moved with purpose now. Meetings stacked back to back, calls taken behind closed doors. Her tone sharpened, though she never raised her voice. Power like hers didn't need volume. Victoria, on the other hand, unraveled in small but telling ways. She forgot names, mixed up dates, snapped at staff. Once, during a planning lunch, she accused a waiter of switching her wine, because, apparently, incompetence tastes exactly like Pinot Noir when you're stressed. Ethan oscillated. One moment he was confident, almost triumphant. The next restless, distracted. He slept lightly. Started asking questions that came too late to matter. "You're sure you're okay with everything?" he asked one night, watching me carefully. I looked up from my laptop. "With what?" He hesitated. "The gala, my family, the pace." I smiled. "You're the one who proposed." He laughed nervously. "Right, just checking." People like Ethan don't ask questions to hear answers. They ask to reassure themselves that the script hasn't changed. It had. They just didn't know which scene they were in anymore. Behind the scenes, Samuel and I worked quietly. No hacking, no theatrics, just documentation. Financial filings don't lie. They just assume no one will read them all in one sitting. Victoria's signature appeared everywhere. Approvals, transfers, internal memos. Patterns emerged. Amounts rounded just enough to avoid casual scrutiny. Accounts justified as operational contingencies. Contingencies that paid for jewelry, travel, and an apartment in Miami that had never once been operational. The funniest part? She thought she was clever. Eleanor, meanwhile, was juggling something bigger. The Blackwood Family Trust was under pressure. Not collapse-level pressure, yet, but enough to make alliances urgent. That's where Charlotte came in. The Winthrop family's energy portfolio intersected perfectly with one of the Blackwood's most legally flexible investments. A merger, framed as a partnership, would stabilize both sides. And Ethan was the bow on top, the respectable son, the polished face, the marriage that signaled unity. I was the placeholder keeping him occupied until the deal closed, which made the engagement gala critical. It wasn't just a celebration. It was a signal flare. This family is stable. This family is expanding. This family is untouchable. I spent that week doing something Eleanor would have found deeply offensive. I stayed pleasant. I smiled. I nodded. I thanked people. I listened. At one planning meeting, Victoria said, "We should keep the guest list tight. We don't want surprises." I sipped my coffee and said, "Surprises are only a problem if you're hiding something." She laughed, a little too quickly. Ethan didn't. That night, I received a text from Charlotte. She didn't introduce herself, didn't need to. "We should talk." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I replied, "Sure." We met the next afternoon in a hotel lobby that smelled like wealth and resignation. Charlotte was exactly as advertised. Poised, intelligent, direct. "I'll be honest," she said after we sat down. "This situation is awkward." "That's one word for it," I said. She studied me carefully. "You don't seem angry." "I'm efficient," I replied. She blinked, then smiled despite herself. She didn't apologize. She didn't threaten. She didn't lie. She told me exactly what Ethan had told her. That he cared about me, that our relationship was complicated, that timing was unfortunate. She also told me something else. "The engagement accelerated things," she said. "It wasn't part of the original plan." I nodded. Plans change. She hesitated. "Do you love him?" I thought about it. "I loved who I thought he was," I said. "That version doesn't exist anymore." Charlotte exhaled slowly. "I wish I could say that surprises me." When we stood to leave, she said, "For what it's worth, I don't think you're as invisible as they believe." I smiled. Neither do I. That night, Ethan came home late. He kissed me, distracted, and said, "Big week ahead." "Yes," I said. "Very big." The engagement gala was 3 days away. By then, the documents were organized, the timelines aligned. The right people had been quietly nudged into place. No accusations yet, no scenes, just readiness. Because here's the thing about powerful families. They don't fear confrontation. They fear exposure. And exposure doesn't need volume. It just needs light. As I turned off my laptop that night, I felt something close to amusement. They thought they were hosting a gala. What they were really doing was setting a stage. And every stage, eventually, belongs to the truth. The night before the engagement gala, Eleanor hosted a family-only dinner. That phrase alone should have come with a warning label. Family only, in Blackwood language, meant final alignment. No outsiders, no witnesses, no misunderstandings. At least, not among people who mattered. I was included now, officially, symbolically, conveniently. The dinner was held in the penthouse dining room, the one with the absurdly long table that made conversations feel like diplomatic negotiations between rival nations. Candles were placed with surgical precision. The wine had been decanted long enough to feel smug about itself. Eleanor sat at the head, Victoria to her right, Ethan beside me. I noticed Eleanor had placed me close enough to hear everything, but far enough to be isolated if necessary. Subtle, strategic, very on brand. Dinner started politely. Weather, logistics, how exhausting it was to coordinate an event of this scale. Eleanor spoke as if she were organizing a small summit, not a party with canapes. Then, inevitably, the conversation shifted. "Avery," Eleanor said, folding her napkin again. She did that when preparing to apply pressure. "After the gala, things will move quickly." I nodded. "Weddings have a way of doing that." She smiled thinly. "There will be expectations." There it was again, expectations. The Blackwood family's favorite hobby. Victoria chimed in, swirling her wine. "You'll probably want guidance, from us." "On what?" I asked. "Presentation," she said. "Public roles. You'll be seen differently now." Ethan cleared his throat. "I think Avery's doing fine." Victoria glanced at him. "I wasn't asking." I almost laughed. Almost. Eleanor leaned forward. "We'll want to be sure you're aligned with the family's values." I tilted my head. "Which values are those exactly?" A beat. "Discretion," Eleanor said. "Loyalty," Victoria added. "Practicality," Ethan said, a little too quickly. I smiled. Those are important. Especially discretion, I thought. After dessert, Eleanor excused herself to take a call. Victoria followed shortly after, claiming she needed to check something in the study. Ethan stayed behind, fidgeting with his napkin. He looked nervous. "Avery," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why do you never ask about my family's business?" I met his eyes. "You never offered." He frowned. "Most people would be curious." "Most people are," I said. "I prefer clarity over curiosity." He looked unconvinced. "You're calm. About everything." I shrugged. "Should I be panicking?" "No," he said quickly. "No, I just—" He stopped. That was the moment I realized something important. Ethan wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing control of the story. Later I went to the restroom, and accidentally on purpose took the long way back. The study door was ajar. Voices drifted out. Victoria's, sharp and irritated. "She's not stupid, Mom!" Eleanor's voice followed, low and firm. "She doesn't need to be stupid. She just needs to be grateful." Victoria scoffed. "You think she doesn't notice things? She's been watching us." Eleanor paused. Everyone watches. Very few understand what they're seeing. I stepped away before they could say more. I didn't need to hear the rest. That night, Ethan didn't sleep well. He tossed, checked his phone, went quiet when I asked if everything was okay. I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, mentally reviewing timelines like a pilot before takeoff. The next day arrived bright and indecently cheerful, the engagement gala. By mid-afternoon, the Blackwood estate was unrecognizable. White tents stretched across the lawn, crystal chandeliers hung from temporary structures like defiant displays of excess. A string quartet rehearsed near the fountain, their music drifting through the air with unsettling serenity. I arrived alone. I drove my old Subaru, watching the valet's face carefully as he tried, very politely, to decide whether I was lost. "I'm here for the Blackwood event?" I said. He nodded slowly, as if accepting a plot twist. As I stepped out of the car, I felt it. The shift. Not fear, not excitement. Readiness. Inside, the guests were already gathering. Politicians, executives, donors. People who pretended not to notice one another, while quietly calculating influence. I moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting some, introducing myself to others. And slowly, very slowly, faces began to change. Recognition flickered. Names were whispered. I caught fragments of conversation. "Isn't she? I thought she worked in... No, she's... Good." Near the bar, I spotted Eleanor. She was radiant, commanding, playing host like a general surveying troops. She hadn't seen me yet. I took a glass of champagne and waited. The first crack appeared when Harold Blackwood's old business associate approached me and said, "Avery Cole, of course. I didn't realize." "Realize what?" I asked pleasantly. "That you were that Avery Cole." His voice carried. Eleanor turned. Her smile froze. Not dramatically, not visibly, but just enough. She looked at me then, really looked. At my dress, my posture, my composure. At the version of me she had never bothered to imagine. I raised my glass slightly in her direction. She didn't raise hers back. Across the lawn I saw Victoria staring at her phone, her face slowly draining of color. Ethan appeared beside me, breathless. "People are asking questions," he said. "Yes," I replied. "They tend to do that when they're confused." He swallowed. "About you." I smiled. "About time." The quartet stopped playing. Eleanor moved toward the stage. The gala was about to begin. And for the first time since I met the Blackwoods, I wasn't observing anymore. I was participating. Whether they were ready or not. The moment Eleanor stepped onto the stage, the entire lawn obeyed her. Conversations faded. Glasses paused mid-air. People turned not because they were told to, but because they had learned over decades that attention was a form of currency, and Eleanor Blackwood controlled the exchange rate. She smiled into the microphone. That smile again. Polished, maternal, weaponized. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said. "Family means everything to us. Tradition, continuity, legacy." Legacy was her favorite word when she wanted to imply permanence. Behind her, Ethan stood stiffly, hands clasped, wearing the expression of a man who sensed the floor might give way, but hadn't yet spotted the crack. Victoria hovered off to the side, pretending to check messages while clearly panic-scrolling her own name. I remained where I was, front row, just off-center. Visible, but not aggressive. Present, but not demanding. The best vantage point. Eleanor continued. "Tonight isn't just a celebration. It's the beginning of a new chapter." She gestured for Ethan to step forward. He did. Applause followed, polite and restrained. The kind given out of obligation, not enthusiasm. "And now," Eleanor said, "I'd like to welcome the woman who has captured my son's heart." Her eyes found mine. "Please," she said smoothly. "Avery." The word hung in the air. I felt the shift ripple outward like a dropped glass, subtle at first, then unmistakable. I walked toward the stage, not hurried, not dramatic, just inevitable. As I climbed the steps, I noticed small things. The way Eleanor's jaw tightened, the way Victoria stopped pretending to type, the way Ethan's relief flickered briefly, then vanished. Eleanor handed me the microphone. Her fingers were cold. "Say a few words," she said, her tone suggesting generosity rather than command. I turned to the crowd. Up close, they looked exactly like I expected. Curious, calculating, ready to update their assumptions. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," I began. "But I've learned that sometimes the most important moments aren't the ones you prepare for." A ripple of polite laughter. "Good. Let them relax." "When I first met Ethan," I continued, "I was told I was lucky." More laughter. A few nods. "That I'd been welcomed into a world of opportunity." Eleanor smiled again, this one genuine. "And in many ways," I said, "that was true. Because this family taught me something invaluable." Eleanor's smile faltered. "They taught me how people behave when they believe you have nothing to offer them." Silence. I felt it then, the collective lean in. Not physically, psychologically. "I was spoken over," I said calmly. "Compared to other women. Referred to as temporary, convenient." Ethan stiffened. Victoria's face went pale. Eleanor's eyes hardened. "I was told, very delicately, that relationships aren't about feelings." A murmur passed through the crowd. "I agree," I said. "They're about truth." I paused. Then I said, "So let's talk about truth." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else lowered their glass. "For example," I said, "the truth about financial pressure." Eleanor inhaled sharply. "The Blackwood Family Trust," I continued, "has been struggling more than most people here realize." Harold Blackwood, standing near the back, went very still. "Rapid expansion, over-leveraged investments, regulatory attention." Eleanor stepped forward. "Avery." I held up a hand, politely. She stopped. "Or the truth about internal accountability," I said, turning slightly. "Specifically, the financial activities of Victoria Blackwood." Victoria took a step back. "Expense reallocations, unauthorized transfers, personal purchases disguised as operational costs." Gasps now, no longer polite. "That's a lie," Victoria snapped. "You have no proof." A voice from the crowd spoke up. "I do." Samuel Reed stepped forward, calm, prepared, holding a folder thick enough to intimidate a small nation. He handed it, not to Eleanor, but to a man in a tailored suit standing near the bar. The SEC representative didn't look surprised. That was satisfying. Eleanor tried to regain control. "This is inappropriate. This is not the place." "This," I said gently, "is exactly the place." I turned to Ethan. He looked like a man watching his reflection crack. "There's one more truth," I said. "The truth about us." I reached for my hand and removed the ring. The diamond caught the light in a way that was more revealing than flattering. "This engagement," I said, holding it up, "was never about love." Ethan shook his head. "That's not fair." "You kept seeing Charlotte," I said calmly. "You let your family plan a future without me in it. You lied when I gave you the chance to tell the truth." Charlotte, standing near the edge of the crowd, didn't look surprised. She looked relieved. I placed the ring into Ethan's palm. "You should give this to the person you were actually building a future with." Eleanor found her voice again. "You're doing this because you're embarrassed." I smiled. "No," I said. "I'm doing this because I was underestimated." I turned back to the crowd. "My name is Avery Cole," I said. "I founded a company that quietly supports several of the institutions represented here tonight. I live simply by choice. I stayed silent by design." A few people laughed softly, not mockingly, but in recognition. "And I agreed to this engagement," I finished, "because I wanted everyone involved to have enough rope." I set the microphone down. For a moment, no one moved. Then conversations exploded, loud, chaotic, uncontrolled. Phones came out, people whispered. Others began to leave. Eleanor stood frozen, her carefully constructed narrative collapsing around her like bad architecture. Ethan didn't chase me. He couldn't. As I walked away from the stage, Samuel caught up beside me. "Well," he said dryly, "that was cleaner than I expected." I smiled. I'm an engineer. Outside the tent, the night air felt lighter. Behind me, a legacy was unraveling. Ahead of me, something else waited. And for the first time in weeks, I felt absolutely certain. The quiet part was over. Chaos has a sound. It's not shouting, not crying, not even outrage. It's the low, frantic murmur of people recalculating their proximity to disaster. That sound followed me as I walked away from the stage. Behind me, Eleanor was already trying to regain control. Hands raised, voice firm, issuing instructions like a conductor, insisting the orchestra hadn't just fallen into the pit. "This is a misunderstanding," she said loudly. "There will be a statement." Statements are what people offer when facts refuse to cooperate. I didn't stay to listen. Outside the main tent, the air felt cooler, cleaner. I took a slow breath, the kind that feels earned. My phone buzzed immediately. Then again, and again. I didn't look. Not yet. Samuel joined me near the edge of the lawn, watching the exits with the calm satisfaction of a man who'd waited years for this exact moment. "They're scrambling," he said. "SEC's already pulling people aside." "Good," I replied. "They hate inefficiency." He chuckled. "You know, Eleanor always thought her biggest threat was bad press." "What was it really?" I asked. "Documentation," he said. "Always documentation." Inside the tent, I could see Victoria gesturing wildly, her voice sharp, brittle. Her husband stood a few feet away, arms crossed, staring at her like she'd just introduced herself under a fake name. Harold Blackwood sat heavily in a chair, staring at nothing. And Ethan. Ethan stood exactly where I'd left him, ring still in his hand, expression unreadable. That image surprised me more than it should have. Not because I felt sorry for him, but because he looked smaller. Less like the man I'd dated. More like a boy who'd assumed the world would keep rearranging itself around his convenience. Eventually he found me. He approached slowly, like someone entering unfamiliar territory. "Avery," he said, "we need to talk." I smiled faintly. "We already did." "You blindsided us," he said, his voice tight. "I was very clear," I replied. "You just didn't listen." He ran a hand through his hair. "You didn't have to do it like that." I raised an eyebrow. "Publicly?" "Yes." I considered him for a moment. "You were comfortable lying to me privately," I said. "Why should the truth be more polite than that?" He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "You don't understand what you've done." I laughed, once, softly. "That's where you're wrong," I said. "I understand exactly what I've done. What you don't understand is that this was never about revenge." He scoffed. "Then what was it about?" I leaned in slightly. "Boundaries." For the first time that night, Ethan looked afraid. Not of me, of consequences. Before he could respond, two men in suits approached, professional, neutral, unmistakably official. "Mr. Blackwood," one of them said, "we'll need a few minutes of your time." Ethan glanced at me one last time. I didn't say goodbye. There was no need. As the night unraveled, I stayed just long enough to watch the illusion die. Guests left in clusters, murmuring into phones. A senator I recognized avoided eye contact entirely. A hedge fund manager whispered something to his wife, that made her purse her lips and nod decisively, the universal sign of "we are never coming back here." Eleanor cornered me once more near the garden path. Her composure was remarkable. Cracked, but intact. "You planned this," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "You manipulated my family." "No," I said. "I observed your family. You did the rest yourselves." Her eyes burned. "You think this ends here?" I smiled. "It already has." She stared at me for a long moment, then said, "You could have been one of us." That was almost funny. "I already am," I said, "just not like you." I left before she could respond. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I finally checked my phone. Dozens of messages. Some from numbers I recognized, some I didn't. Investors, journalists, old acquaintances suddenly remembering my name. I ignored most of them. One message stood out, from Charlotte. "For what it's worth, you did what I never could. I hope you're okay," I replied simply. "I am." Then I powered the phone off. The next morning the headlines hit. Not my name, not my face, just facts. Blackwood Family Trust under federal review. SEC investigates alleged financial misconduct. High-profile engagement gala ends in turmoil. I watched the news with a cup of coffee and an expression somewhere between satisfaction and disbelief. It was done. Or so I thought. That afternoon, Samuel called. "It's moving fast," he said. "Faster than I expected." "Meaning?" "Meaning people have been waiting for an excuse," he said. "You just provided a very public one." I leaned back in my chair. "So what happens now?" He paused. "Now? Now they fall. Piece by piece." I hung up and stared out the window. No fireworks, no dramatic music, just sunlight and the quiet certainty that something irreversible had happened. If you're wondering what you would have done in my place, if you'd have walked away quietly or pulled the thread knowing the whole thing might unravel, I'd honestly love to know. Drop it in the comments. People always think they know, until they're the one holding the scissors. That evening, as I poured myself a glass of wine, I laughed out loud for the first time in weeks. Because somewhere in the city, a family that believed itself untouchable was discovering that power, like wealth, is only impressive until it's audited. And audits, unfortunately for them, are very thorough. Collapse doesn't happen all at once. That's the lie movies tell you. Sirens, headlines, doors kicked in before breakfast. Real collapse is quieter. It sounds like phones that stop ringing, emails that go unanswered, invitations that are postponed indefinitely. The week after the gala, New York shifted around the Blackwoods the way water moves around a sinking ship. Subtle, efficient, unforgiving. On Monday morning, the Blackwood Family Trust issued a statement. It was exactly what you'd expect. Carefully worded, aggressively vague, and deeply allergic to responsibility. "We take these allegations seriously. We are cooperating fully. We are confident this matter will be resolved." By Tuesday afternoon, the word confident had disappeared from every draft. Samuel kept me updated, though he never pushed. He understood something most people don't, that once the truth is released, it no longer belongs to you. It belongs to momentum. And momentum, once it starts, is brutal. The SEC investigation widened within 48 hours. What had begun as irregularities became systemic issues. What had been internal reviews turned into subpoenas. Victoria was placed on immediate leave. That detail made me pause. Not because I felt sorry for her, but because I knew what it meant. Families like the Blackwoods don't remove people unless they have to. Publicly distancing themselves from Victoria was the equivalent of cutting ballast. She was no longer an asset. She was weight. By Thursday, her name was everywhere. Expense fraud, Misappropriation, failure of oversight. Her lawyers tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, a rogue executive acting independently. No one bought it. By Friday, Harold Blackwood quietly resigned from 2 boards. No press conference, no statement. Just a name removed from websites like it had never been there. Eleanor, on the other hand, fought. She always would have. She gave interviews framed as concern for transparency. She spoke about legacy, philanthropy, her disappointment in being misled. She never mentioned me, not once. Which was smart. Mentioning me would have raised questions she couldn't control. Ethan vanished. Not literally, but socially. His firm put him on leave, citing temporary conflicts. Friends stopped inviting him places. Texts went unanswered. One afternoon, I saw him across the street outside a cafe we used to go to. He looked thinner, less certain, like a man who'd spent his life assuming doors would open and had just discovered they could close silently. He didn't see me. I didn't call out. Some endings don't need closure. They just need distance. Meanwhile, my own life continued in a way that felt almost surreal. My company moved forward with its IPO timeline, quietly and efficiently. No drama, no statements, just work. That contrast struck me more than anything. The Blackwoods were unraveling in public. I was building in private. One afternoon, my COO asked gently, "Do you want to address any of this?" I shook my head. It's not my story. And it wasn't. This wasn't about a woman scorned or a billionaire revenge fantasy. It was about a system encountering accountability and finding itself poorly insulated. Samuel called late one night. "They're negotiating," he said. "With who?" "Everyone," he replied. "Investors, regulators, former partners who suddenly remember questionable decisions." "And Victoria?" A pause. "She's cooperating." That didn't surprise me. People like Victoria are brave until bravery gets expensive. "She's pointing fingers," he added. "Upward." I closed my eyes. "That won't save her," I said. "No," Samuel agreed, "but it might shorten her sentence." We sat in silence for a moment. Then he said, "You know, there's something almost funny about this." I raised an eyebrow, though he couldn't see it. "Go on." "They spent years convincing themselves they were untouchable," he said. "And all it took was one person who didn't want anything from them." I smiled. The media cycle moved on, as it always does. New scandals, new villains, new outrage. The Blackwoods became a cautionary tale, a footnote, a lesson whispered in boardrooms. Be careful who you underestimate. One morning, while scrolling headlines, I saw a small article buried halfway down the page. Winthrop Energy announces strategic withdrawal from pending partnership. Charlotte had pulled out. Cleanly. Publicly. Without comment. I imagine Eleanor reading that headline. I didn't imagine her smiling. A few days later, an envelope arrived at my apartment. No return address. Inside was a single page. A resignation letter. Ethan's. Not addressed to me, just included. At the bottom, handwritten, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I understand now." I folded the paper and placed it in a drawer. Understanding is nice, but timing matters. That night I stood by my window, city lights flickering like 1,000 unrelated lives continuing without regard for any one family's collapse. I thought about how close I'd come to marrying into that world, about how easily my life could have narrowed into negotiations and silence and careful compromise. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not triumph. Relief. The kind that comes when you step off a path that would have cost you yourself. Somewhere downtown, lawyers were still billing hours. Regulators were still reviewing documents. A legacy was still being dismantled. But for me, it was already over. The only thing left was forward. And forward, I'd learned, is a direction best traveled light. The strange thing about the end of a long battle is how quiet it feels. No applause, no closing credits, Just the slow return of ordinary sounds. The hum of traffic, the clink of a mug against a countertop, the email notification reminding you that yes, you still have a job and it still expects things from you. A month after the engagement gala, the Blackwood name stopped appearing in headlines. Not because everything was resolved, because everything important was. Investigations continued, quietly and relentlessly. Victoria's cooperation became a matter of record. Eleanor's interviews dried up. Harold retreated entirely from public life, as if absence itself might count as dignity. The family that once curated its image like a museum exhibit had learned an inconvenient truth. Silence only works when no one's asking questions. I was asked questions. A few, anyway. Journalists reached out, circling politely, trying to frame me as either a mastermind or a scorned fiancé with a very expensive grudge. I declined every interview. Not out of fear, out of boredom. My life didn't improve because the Blackwoods fell. It improved because I didn't fall with them. Work settled into its familiar rhythm. Meetings, deadlines, small victories that no one clapped for but mattered anyway. The IPO moved forward, deliberately and without spectacle. When it happened quietly. No champagne towers, no dramatic speeches, just numbers changing on a screen. I celebrated by ordering takeout and watching a documentary about octopuses. We all choose our own version of luxury. Samuel and I met one last time, a few weeks later, at the same wine bar where he'd first recognized me. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said, and meant it. He smiled. "You know, for what it's worth, this story will get told, with or without you." "I know," I said. "I just don't need to narrate it." He raised his glass. "To inconvenient women." I clinked mine against his. "To thorough paperwork." We laughed. After that, life simplified in the best possible way. I moved apartments, not because I needed more space, but because I wanted sunlight in the mornings. I started saying no to things that felt heavy and yes to things that felt light. I stopped explaining myself to people who weren't curious enough to listen anyway. One afternoon, while reorganizing a drawer, I found the engagement ring box. Empty. I had returned the ring that night. The box had somehow followed me home, like an awkward party favor no one asked for. I stared at it for a moment, then laughed and used it to store spare change. It felt appropriate. Ethan never contacted me again. I heard about him, occasionally, through the vague social grapevine. He'd moved cities, changed firms, was keeping a low profile. I hoped he was. Low profiles have a way of encouraging introspection. Charlotte sent me one final message months later. "I'm moving overseas, new chapter. Thank you for what you did, even if it wasn't for me." I wished her well. She deserved a life that didn't require contingency plans. As for Eleanor Blackwood, I never saw her again. But once, walking through the city, I passed a woman who wore the same perfume she did. Something sharp and expensive and faintly exhausting. For a split second, my body tensed. Then it passed. Power loses its scent once it's gone. On a quiet Sunday morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened my laptop. Not for work, but for myself. I wrote down a few things. Not resolutions, just reminders. That silence is a tool, not a personality. That being underestimated is only dangerous if you believe it. That love without honesty is just another transaction. And that walking away is not the same as losing. Sometimes it's the cleanest win there is. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent, relentless, alive. I finished my coffee, grabbed my keys, and headed out the door. There was work to do, people to meet, systems to build that didn't depend on fear or legacy or last names carved into marble walls. The Blackwoods would become a case study, a warning, a story people told each other over drinks. I would become something else entirely. Not famous, not feared. just free. And honestly, that felt like the richest ending of all. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how everything ended, if I ever wish I'd stayed quiet, kept the peace, chosen comfort over conflict. The truth is, I don't think about the Blackwoods anymore. Not because what happened didn't matter, but because it taught me something permanent. Your life only belongs to you once you stop asking permission to live it. I didn't win because I was richer. I didn't win because I was smarter. I won because I refused to disappear quietly for the convenience of people who never intended to protect me. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause, question, or see something differently, then it did what it was meant to do. There are more stories like this, stories about power, silence, truth, and the moments that change who we become. If you want to hear them, take a second to subscribe. It helps this channel more than you might realize, and it tells me you're someone who values stories that don't look away when things get uncomfortable. Thank you for listening. And remember, being underestimated is only a weakness if you accept it. I'll see you in the next story.